A divisive culture always communicates conflicting messages. I recognize it's easier to talk about love than to practice it. And whether you're a follower of Christ or not, none of us have perfected love in our behavior. A divisive culture always wants to shift the blame. It's convenient for me to classify you as the problem while ignoring my behavior. The Apostle Paul writes a letter to Titus, a young pastor who's leading the Cretan churches. And like our society, his culture was polarized as well. And Paul instructs Titus to remind the Christians on Crete to be good citizens within their communities, a virtue that was seriously lacking with Cretans and with us. So Paul understands that our behavior reveals the power of God's grace. Titus's instructions to the Cretan churches are timely for each of us. He reminds them to be submissive to rulers and authorities, to be obedient, to be ready for every good work, to speak evil of no one, to avoid quarreling, to be gentle, to show perfect courtesy toward all people. These behaviors are concrete examples of the behavior required of those who understand God's grace. So before we're quick to find fault with others, let's not forget, before we received God's grace, we were foolish, we were disobedient, we were led astray, we were slaves to various passions and pleasures, we passed our days in malice and envy, we were hated by others, and we hated one another. Now that's the reality of people who live apart from God. But God's grace saves us, not because of any righteous acts that we do, but because of His mercy. And what God's grace begins in us, God's grace performs in us. A divisive culture only experiences unity by God's grace that transforms foolish behavior into acts of good works, so that all will see the glory, the majesty, and the beauty of God. Let's compare our behavior this week with Titus's list before we criticize others. I pray you will have a blessed week.